My name is Wenhong Chen. Together with Dr. Adisa Perrin, I co-direct the Center for Entertainment and the Media Industries. Thank you very much for joining us today. Given what happened last week, I understand many people are still recovering in the regrouping. I'd like to thank the graduate school, the Department of Radio, TV, and Film, Journalism, and Media for their financial support, as well as our friends at the Center for East Asian Studies and the Center for Asian American Studies for helping us to promote the event. I would like to thank our student co-organizers, Maria Scaras and Josh Xiao, for all the logistic support. Now it's my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Iris Chyi. Dr. Chyi is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Media at UT Austin. She specializes in media economics, and her work identifies universal patterns of user demand for multi-platform newspapers. Her Ramen Noodle theory suggests that online news, like Ramen Noodles, is an inferior good. Her book, Trial and Error, U.S. Newspapers' Digital Struggles Towards Inferiority, challenge U.S. newspapers' technology-driven strategy, calling for a critical reassessment of the future of the industry. Dr. Chyi's work has received many research awards and has published more than 50 journal articles in the book chapters. Her work, as you can imagine, has received substantial attention from the news industry worldwide and often triggers intensive debate on the future of print media among publishers, journalists, and other digital influencers. She has spoken at major industry conferences around the world and advised news organizations, including the New York Times. Now, please welcome Dr. Chyi to give us an extremely timely talk on the future of the newspaper industry in this country and beyond.
Thank you very much, Wenhong. Thanks a lot for having me here. And I would like to thank everybody for showing up after such a difficult week. And I'm eager to share with you my latest findings about, the results of the U.S. newspapers' paywall experiment, which of course was impacted by COVID. And, it has a lot of implications for the future of newspapers. So hopefully you'll feel interested as well. And during this talk, feel free to ask any questions anytime. Just I don't mind being interrupted. So I would like to actually have a conversation if possible. Okay. So I would like to talk about the title of the talk. Originally, this is the original title with perhaps in parentheses, and then the organizer probably thought I meant perhaps that's my title. So the word perhaps was dropped. So that added some pressure. So I have to make sure I don't make a lot of mistakes because people are expecting a final verdict on this important topic. Okay, so I'll just get started. First of all, as I usually do, I'll briefly review the newspaper industry's digital transformation process in 10 slides. I promise I'll be quick. Starting in 1996, which is exactly 25 years ago, the New York Times went online. And by 1999, most newspapers were already providing online services. Since then, everything looked like the next thing. I'm going to show you a few more digital devices. And it's kind of hard to imagine today. This e-reader actually once was believed to be able to save newspapers, as this particular story suggested. And it's also interesting that, you know, New York Times described Kindle as their own knight in shining digital armor. Okay, so that's a narrative back in 2009. And definitely we had smartphones and tablets. I believe this was 2010. All the excitement, and you can see New York Times in every image because that, you know, as a pioneer and an industry leader, they try very hard to try everything. So, and the Apple Watch back in 2015. And I think this is interesting that they describe these one-sentence stories as a new form of storytelling. I think that's a little bit exaggerating, in my opinion. And definitely social media. They hire social media editors everywhere. So they try also blogging, Flash, audio, video, and even virtual reality. Okay, so in short, according to Robert Picard, it's hard to find technology that news organizations don't embrace. I think that's very true. And I call this, you know, a technology-driven approach, because the focus seems to be always, you know, the new thing could save newspaper. That has always been the narrative. Okay, so that was more than 20 years of digital transformation process in just a few slides. Unfortunately, to this day, the vast majority of newspapers have found no viable revenue models for any of their digital products. So that's actually a very sad statement, but I think we're not yet into any controversial discussion. So basically, that's just the case as of today. And the reason why those papers were so, you know, into this digital initiative or experiment is because they were acting upon two assumptions. The first one, print is dying, and the second, future is online. I have to confess, you know, 25 years ago when I became interested in this research topic, I shared this, you know, mentality as well. Everybody, including myself, was excited about digital technology and, you know, the potential of what it can do, especially for news purposes. But as a researcher, I look at demand. I look at empirical data mostly from the demand side, meaning through surveys, market research, and things like that. So to me, it's like I really, after a while, you know, I don't see these anymore. So I thought, wait a minute. You know, there's no evidence suggesting any of these two assumptions is true. So I started, you know, I continued my research program on this topic because it's so intriguing. There's this distance or disparity between what you know as a researcher and what the industry has been doing. So, but anyway, the research suggests that despite the decline that we all are probably aware of, the print edition remains the core product, outperforming digital news products by almost every standard. So that's a very intriguing finding throughout all these years. So up till a year ago, I still firmly believe, that's the whole story. So, and I almost 20 years ago, I already came up with an explanation for this superior or stronger than expected performance of print products, which is very often described as the dead tree edition. Okay. So the explanation is the ramen noodles theory of online news. It's kind of sad that, my colleague will come up with, a theory called agenda setting that sounds so fabulous. But my theory is like ramen noodles theory. But I think it's quite interesting. So I would like to spend a few minutes explaining. In economics, there is a concept called inferior good. And the classic examples include ramen noodles, fast food, or bus travel. Things that you consume less when your income goes up, and vice versa. So other things being equal, of course. So on the other hand, most products are normal goods, meaning the richer you get, the more you buy. So like steak, okay. But for ramen noodles, like the poorer you get, you eat more ramen noodles or instant noodles. So and there's a measure, basically, you just try to measure that relationship between income and consumption. So I suggest that online news, and also we actually found empirical evidence. Online news is an inferior good, while the print paper is a normal good. And they coexist not as two normal goods, but as a combination of an inferior and a normal good. So this is a lousy photo I took during an iSage luncheon. So that's just, that explains why after all these years, still you are seeing the print product outperforming digital news products by almost all standards. Okay, so that has been the case. However, since 2011, the industry started again. There's a long story behind their paywall history, but the latest round of experiment started in 2011. Oh my God, it's exactly 10 years ago. It's been a decade. So I think it's the right time to really revisit what has been done and what has been achieved or not. So basically, New York Times and the Dallas Morning News, they both started the paywall back in 2011. And I remember I shared my research findings at that time with the publisher of the Dallas Morning News, Jim Maroney, and then he said to me, "I hope Iris is wrong." So basically, it's been 10 years. And the rationale behind that, paywall thing, meaning charging online users for digital news access, is because advertising revenue fell short. But I was thinking, well, simply because advertising did not work, does that mean subscription should? At that point, I was already being a little cynical because of this consistent inconsistency between what research says and what the industry does. So, and in recent years, reader revenue has become the new goal, again, for the same reason, because advertising did not work. So, and there has been some good, signs. So first thing is like Trump bump, which is, news organizations saw like increase in subscribers after the 2016 election. And you saw headlines like this one after another, not just for New York Times, but of course, New York Times has been the poster child for digital subscription. So almost every quarter during the past 10 years or so, you saw a story like this. New York Times reports 24 million profits thanks to digital subscribers. Okay. Almost every story emphasized how digital subscriptions turn out to be a success. And we don't want to go into this now, but because today I'm going to share with you mostly data about local papers, but yeah, anyway, so don't get me started here. Okay, so, but to me, as a researcher on this topic for, at that point, 15 or more years, I think this is too good to be true, really. I mean, are we really seeing fundamental changes in consumer behavior? Because time and time again, willingness to pay for online news, according to all kinds of different researchers, almost did not exist, or is this the most recent example of wishful thinking? And not just in terms of paying. Basically, the gap between print and digital has been around and then so persistent. And again, the supposedly dying product, outperforms the same newspaper's digital offerings by all means in terms of readership, engagement, subscription, advertising, and recently I also found pricing. So basically, it's kind of boring, right? There's no mixed findings in this. It's just so straightforward. Print, better than digital, okay? And all by a wide margin. So it's just not it's not like P, P value is not the point here. I don't even need to run t-tests or whatever to get this argument. Okay, so by 4 years ago, I finally reached a point where I came up with this verdict or conclusion, which is it's hard not to conclude that there's no all digital future for newspapers. And you notice that I use double negative because you will sound too confident because everybody else is believing something else. But I have to say it's hard not to conclude that there's no digital future for newspapers. Okay, so now that was about 4 years ago. Guess what? COVID hit, right? So that actually got me interested in this topic again. Because, so a year ago, I asked myself, will this pandemic change all these? After all, I think that, this is like a real opportunity for digital news products because demand for local news or any news definitely goes up during a crisis like this. And then, at the same time, there are concerns about physical products carrying the virus. I believe some print newspaper readers will have that concern. And people were under financial stress. So, the print product was far more expensive. And everything is just more online than ever. That's why we are here doing this Zoom thing. It's my very first Zoom presentation in my life, actually. So actually, because all these, you believe, you kind of believe, the conclusions you reached about digital subscription just not long ago, would they stay or would they hold anymore? So I became really intrigued by what's the impact of COVID on the number of subscribers, news organizations, are able to attain or attract. So let me rewind a little bit. And I'm glad to see Margaret here. She is my co-author on this article, published, look at the date, March 9th, 2020, meaning maybe just a few days before COVID, changed the world. This got published in Digital Journalism. And we look at 50 US newspapers' digital subscription results, but the data were from 2017. And I guess you know why, because it always takes forever to get anything published. So 2 years or more. So that's, still that was or still is the most comprehensive paywall study with industry data. So let me share with you some of the key findings that Margaret and I discovered. So we look at the top 15 newspapers monitored by the Pew Center, actually. So we just use the same sample. And we look at the pricing and digital circulation data from the AAM, which is this auditing body, or used to be called ABC. So I did not, we didn't collect the data ourselves. We just used audited industry data. So the first finding of our studies, in terms of number of subscribers, and I'm sorry to present so many numbers, but just look at these two columns. Digital non-replica means web, tablets, apps, anything that we know, newspaper, or they've been trying so hard to develop digital products. And that's the number of subscribers. Actually, look at the first column and then compare that number with the third column, which is print circulation. Again, remember, long time ago, they already announced that print is dead, or is dying at least. So that's the gap, which is the circulation gap. It's deep and wide. There's no, again, do I need to do any statistical test? No, just by eyeballing, the huge difference between digital and print circulation, right? So same thing for the rest. And so in sum, the difference is like 5,000 or so versus 100,000. That's the gap. And again, that's not the whole story, because we also need to look at the price. So we did that. And this is probably even more surprising, at least to me, okay? So look at the Denver Post. We're talking about $72 a year for digital, all digital access, and $754 for the print edition, 7-day home delivery. So 72 versus 754. And go back here. Which edition has more subscribers? Print, okay? So, and more examples, New York Times will cost you more than $1,000 a year in print. And even a local paper like the Kansas City Star would cost, again, the same amount, actually more than New York Times back in 2017. Okay, and then you have the Boston Globe, which again is probably considered the best performing newspaper in terms of digital subscription among local newspapers. Guess what? Their print edition costs $1,300 a year, which is unbelievable to say the least, right? Versus $360 for the digital edition. So these are just facts, but they are not talked about a lot about at all. Oops. So we're talking about on average 132 for digital and 546 for print. So it takes 4 digital subscribers to generate as much income as 1 print subscriber. That's 4 to 1. And that's not just the whole story, because very often you see these promotional offers like this one. The San Diego paper, 16 weeks for just 99 cents, okay? And that's just, and the norm is like 25 cents a week, according to what we did. Okay, so in one sentence, far more people pay a lot more for newspapers in print than online. So it's not more people, but also they pay a lot more. So it's like not just a gap in circulation, but also a gap in price. Okay, and so how about this new concept, or buzzword, reader revenue, meaning subscription revenue? We are talking about, according to our data, we estimated that digital subscriptions accounted for less than 3% of total reader revenue. Yeah, so 3%. Okay, so basically, I believe personally that was almost the final verdict on the future of digital subscriptions for newspapers. So, but still, I had perhaps in parentheses. So, according to Margaret and myself, a consistent lack of pay intent, raising serious concerns about the viability of the subscription model as a revenue source. Okay, again, just a few days before COVID. So has COVID changed that final verdict at all? So to refresh my data this time, I decided to just quickly pull the data, which I did a few days ago, without first considering reviewers' needs. So I this time I'm eager to really know and then share such findings. So from that sample of 50 papers, I pull data from 20 of those based on how comprehensive the data points are. So basically, these are papers with very few missing data points. So I look at 2019 and then the 2 quarters last year. That's the latest one was Q3, the 3rd quarter, nothing newer yet is available. So these are 3 points that I look at. So here I'm going to very rarely share some good news about digital subscriptions. If you know my work, you know very rarely I have good news to deliver. So this is unusual, at least for me. So this is the Miami paper. You look at, this is page circulation for the digital non-replica edition, meaning web, again, apps. So that's the growth. If you look at this part, very dramatic, actually. So I'll just go very quickly through this. Seattle Times, even more beautiful, if you look at the numbers. Denver Post, Newsday. Again, Margaret and I, we look at 2017. So everything after that, you see a very obvious upward trend. And it's kind of dramatic if you look at just the last 2 data points. Los Angeles Times, Charlotte. Okay, so overall, even this one, at least you're not seeing any declines, right? So overall, it's kind of good news, right? Our San Antonio Express News. Okay. And so that's the data. going to share with you. You can just take a look, but basically that's a summary. You see, if you look at the median, which is probably less biased, doubled in just a year. And then that's the average or mean. Still, overall, you're talking about each of these 20 papers in my sample, they gained 16,000 digital subscribers over the past year. Okay. That's a 64% increase. That's kind of dramatic or substantial because remember in our paper earlier, we were talking about 5,000 each paper. So this is a dramatic difference. So that, that answers partly the question, has COVID changed that relationship? So I would say this is good news, but that's probably not the whole story again. So again, I ask these questions. What happened to print circulation, and at what price are we seeing this digital surge? Are there other factors driving this growth or change? Does this digital surge translate into revenue gain or not? So I look at the print side as well. Let's see. Yeah, you see a very different trend, right? Going down as expected. Okay, and it's kind of bad if you look at the differences. Each paper in the sample lost 17,000 subscribers. That's a 21% decrease, probably the worst ever, because during the recession, they were talking about like at most 12% or so. That was already bad, but this is 21% in a year. So this is really, really significant. So basically, if I use one chart to summarize both sides, digital versus print, this is how it looks. I'm using the medians of the 20 papers to get this summary. So print goes down and then digital goes up. Is this good news? Does this look like good news to you? Again, finally we get some mixed findings. So it seems on the one hand that digital transformation is finally working because they hope, print readers will actually convert themselves to digital for reasons I don't quite understand. But that has been the rationale or the goal. So this is kind of going on. But let me also ask, at what price are we seeing the surge? Because in our previous study, we look at the price. And we actually, this time I found the widening gap. So I'm going to share that with you. So the first column, promotional price. Again, nothing quite different, but here we are seeing some record low promotional offer. The Boston Globe, remember? We look at that. 4 cents a week. That's how much you pay as a new subscriber. 4 cents a week. Okay. But that's a promotional offer anyway. So let's also look at the regular price. So this is, I calculate the yearly price so that we can compare that with the print subscription rate. So that's around 100 or so on average. And for print, please pay attention. This is something that I didn't even expect. I didn't quite expect. Are you seeing like so many papers are charging more than $1,000 compared with the previous data I showed? That's just insane. I'm sorry for my language, but this is so dramatic. And then of course, previously I also did this paper with Ori. This is what, so I combine the data sets, and this is the trend. Look at the Los Angeles Times. The price of that 7-day delivery started in $100 in 2008, and now it's what, $800 or nearly $900 in just less than, in about 10 years. Isn't that dramatic? Can you come up with anything else that got so expensive so quickly over time? It's just and look at this paper in New York State, from 260 to nearly 1,300. And again, the Boston Globe remains the most expensive paper, local paper in this country. But remember, 4 cents a week, that's the promotional rate.
Iris?
Yes.
Can I ask a question about this data?
Sure.
How are you calculating like these prices?
Okay, I got the data from the audited report filed by these newspapers to AAM. So they, each year in their annual audit report, they had to, specify how much they charge readers. But of course, this is not, for every single reader, because they have different contracts. But overall, that's their self-reports.
So that's their self-reported like retail price, and if you paid full price for the Newsday, it was going to be $12.99.
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure. And also I saw something that I did not see previously. For example, some like a promotional offer like this. Again, the Boston Globe, please read. $1 for the first 26 weeks. That's how I got that 4 cents a week number. $1, and you get to enjoy this local paper for 26 weeks. And if this indicates anything, this is how difficult it is to acquire new subscribers, even, in Boston, a market like that. So, and that's, Boston Globe is not the only paper doing it, actually. For example, this one in Iowa is offering the same thing, $1 for 6 months. And it emphasized this on both sides of the web page. So this is getting really, really intriguing. So in sum, the impact of COVID on newspaper subscriptions can be summarized like this. Digital subscription, or digital circulation went up as expected. We're talking about 16K per paper. Again, this is for the 20 papers in my sample only. But these are major daily papers, metro daily papers in the country. And print circulation went down as expected, about the same number. 17,000 per paper. So the circulation gap actually narrowed, as I showed in that chart, right? Print is at 48K. That's a very pessimistic or depressing number. If you think about, these used to be major daily papers in metropolitan markets. So versus 21K for digital. That's after the surge. 48 versus 21K. So the gap actually narrowed, but still you see print being the core product by circulation. And the price gap is, again, as I said, something that's really, really shocking. Price gap actually widened you're talking about more than $1,000. That's the average of these 20, or the median of these 20 papers in print versus only 180 for digital. That's a huge gap, right? So as a result, reader revenue actually shrank because you are losing the same amount. You're gaining subscribers, but they are paying not nearly as much. So actually overall revenue decline. That's the impact of, that's the impact of this COVID period. So what's driving this surge then? So it's definitely COVID, but if you look at this price gap, I'm sure like me, you believe, the skyrocketing price of the print edition definitely play a role too, because economics 101 suggests that when price goes up, demand or consumption actually goes down, right? So that's just the law. So not just COVID, but the price of the print edition, which is a related product. So is this good news? From the revenue perspective, it's not at all. Honestly, I still have to calculate exactly by what's the percentage of revenue loss, but definitely you are seeing a loss. So once again, we are seeing this analog dollars turn into digital dimes scenario. Okay, this has been ongoing, but during this pandemic, this quickened dramatically because we've never seen print circulation decline so quickly in just a year. So digital dimes, it'll be okay if many subscribers are paying digital dimes, right? But that's not easy at all because you are not the New York Times. So, but let's again take a look at the New York Times, which again is the poster child for digital subscriptions, which deserves a study of its own. So for the Times, its digital revenue exceeded print revenue for the very first time in less than a year ago. This is not a typo. So that's 2020 second quarter. For the very first time, despite all the hype or coverage about the growth of their digital subscriptions over all these years. And how many subscribers did it take for that to happen? 5.7 million online-only subscribers to reach the point where you finally had more digital revenue than print revenue. So here the number is 5.7 million as opposed to 21,000 as revealed in our study of the local newspapers. Okay, so so it's not okay because you don't have 5.7. Most papers do not have 5.7 million subscribers. And because they are local papers, there's no way to have that scale, right? So there's still, up to this point, I'm not seeing the digital future for local papers. If you see it, let me know. So the real crisis is that print circulation was hit hard by dramatic price hikes and COVID. So it's the crisis. Because the print edition remains the core product even after this, and the primary revenue driver. Okay, so this is something that's really concerning. So after reporting some good news to you very quickly, I'm going back to this, bad news mode, and this time it's actually very bad. And some of you may wonder, why, still as of today, this still remains the case. I mean, the gap between print and digital, despite it's been narrowed by during the past few months. So I have to circle back to that ramen noodle theory, because obviously this is the case. People are willing to pay a lot more for steak as opposed to ramen noodles. Okay, so that's just and it's obvious, newspapers should have realized that there's a fundamental difference between the two products. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. So, for example, if you subscribe to any print products, they will give you free access, all digital access. What's the point of doing it? Meaning, they are trying to push print readers to the digital side. Otherwise, why offering those readers digital access for free? And that, again, is a digital first, or the belief that they have to transform themselves digitally to survive. However, data does not tell the same story at all. But hopefully there is a silver lining in all these that I would like to conclude today's talk with, which is newspapers' competitive advantage lies in print, which is just a fact. And that product remains the format readers prefer and are willing to pay a lot for. But of course, because of the more than dramatic price hikes, I think newspapers are actually alienating their print readers for no good reason. So other than cost saving, but cost saving alone is not going to save newspapers. You have to invest. You have to really serve quality content on platforms preferred by your readers. But that has not been the case during the past 20 or so years. So is it too late? I'm not sure, but this is just what I would like to share with you today. Thanks a lot for being here. Any questions?
Thank you, Iris. Now I think all the audience members know why Iris' talk has triggered intense debate both within and beyond the industry about the future of print news media. I have a lot of questions and comments.
Okay.
Yeah, but I will let other people start. Yeah.
I run the risk every time I talk about my view or my research finding, I run the risk of being seen as a dinosaur. So very often I have to emphasize, I came from the digital side and I became interested not in the print newspaper, but in digital news, back in the late 90s. Yeah. So but overall, gradually based on research, I changed my view about the future of newspapers. But anyway. So any questions? Hi, Joe.
Okay, so this may not be available in the data you're looking at, but you commented on it that you wondered whether the fairly radical price hikes of the print product are driving readers away. And so, I'm wondering, again, this leaps outside into more kind of industry strategy, but you've talked to papers, you've been involved with this. So I've got two questions. One is, why are the price hikes for the print products so radically increased? I mean, I'm personally one of those casualties for the New York Times. I subscribed to the print for 15 years and then began to realize this is getting more and more and more expensive all the time. So when the option to go digital came, it wasn't a particularly hard choice. So I guess it's a question about their strategy and consumer reaction.
Yes, that started, I think, around around the time when the recession hit.
Mhm.
So at that point, advertising revenue dropped dramatically during the recession. So
Right.
papers, they panicked and they realized, at that point, because advertising accounted for more than 50% of the overall revenue. So they panicked. And then one way out was to raise the price of the relatively cheap print product at that time. So, like the Dallas Morning News was one of the pioneers doing it. But I never imagined that, this would continue as industry practice throughout all these years. And then to the point that the price hikes became so radical. Because, again, the paper Ori and I did, we used 2016 data, and then the average was like $500 or so. But now we're talking about $1,000 in just 3 years. So many, actually during the past few months, many colleagues in journalism actually mentioned that they can no longer afford newspaper subscriptions. That definitely says something about the future of print. And again, this is not because your readers, dislike or lose interest in this print edition, which again is like steak in comparison to ramen noodles. It's because this price hikes driving people away. So of course, consumers can no longer afford. And also, if you're, I think research just not long ago released saying most people could only afford one newspaper subscription, right? So if you have New York Times, there's no way you could probably for another local paper. So that's actually a crisis for most local papers. So I guess that's a strategy, a very short-sighted strategy. Very quickly, you can generate more revenue because print readers have been loyal. But to the point, now you're talking about $1,300 for a year. Imagine this is more expensive than the latest iPhone. Why? Because an iPhone could last for more than a year, right? At least 2 years, I guess. And mine is like already 3 or 4 years. But so you're talking about a price tag that's just at least twice as more expensive as iPhone. That's just unacceptable in many ways. So yeah, that's the answer to your question.
Iris, may I build on this Q&A between
Sure.
you and Joe? So because most of us here are in higher education, there is actually educational subscription price, right? Like for instance, I subscribe to New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. It's all educational price. So it's a very affordable.
All in print?
Only Wall Street Journal in print, because they make it impossible for me to stop home delivery. I can tell you, I try so hard to find a way to stop the home delivery. I just cannot do that. And I think it's important for them to have a certain number of home delivery so they can show, to their advertisers. But my question is, who are actually the print subscribers? How many of them are actually institutions, like hotels, bars, libraries?
Actually, not many. The audit report, actually, I can actually stop share, or yeah, mostly we're talking about individuals still, because they actually in the audit report they would specify whether these are educational or hotel subscriptions. So yeah.
Very good. I saw Rusty and Christopher have been raising their hand for a while. So go ahead.
Hi, I really, really enjoyed your talk, and I had a couple of questions, but I'm only going to ask one and then wait for another round to ask the second one. But my primary question revolves around conglomerate ownership of newspapers. I'm coming from the media studies side, so I'm more familiar with entertainment media and not news media, but I'm wondering how much conglomerate ownership factors into your methodology, particularly when you're showing these statistics of price raises, the price rates rising over several years, and how much that is attributed to which companies are owning which local papers, and if there's sort of similarities in those rates versus commonly owned papers.
That's a good question, because definitely chain ownership is a big issue. I think just last year, we now have the largest ever newspaper chain in the country, and then many consider that's not good news. But most of my research, as I said, I look at things from the demand side, meaning as a consumer, what does that mean to you? So I have not looked at how pricing is related to ownership yet, but based on these, it's a very general phenomenon. So, but definitely it's going to be interesting if we also consider ownership as a factor in this.
Thank you.
Very good, Christopher.
Yeah, hey Iris, it's good to see you again. It's been a long time.
I know.
But I'm curious as to if you see because they have hacked away at their print products, the digital products are subpar. That the newspapers really see the business side really sees no way out except for to try any way desperately they can to get digital subscriptions, because really both products on many levels are subpar now, whereas at least in 2008 2009 the print product was still pretty good or great compared to the digital product. So what do you think? Do you think it's just this hanging on to the to any way possible to try to build that digital revenue, even though it just seems like it's never going to happen?
I think there's very little hope. Why? Because in terms of advertising, Google and Facebook, they get all the dollars, ad dollars, right? So in terms of subscription, this is what I've been researching for all these years. So and why is advertising or subscription, why none of these actually work? The real reason actually is behind readership, because not that many people actually read visit these newspapers websites to begin with, and they don't engage much even when they do visit. So the problem behind this revenue issue is engagement. So that's why I said it's like ramen noodles. It works, but nobody really loves ramen noodles. It's just something that's there and that's cheap, that's convenient, but nobody is willing to pay a lot for that. And also online, why even bother paying for digital news from news organizations when they actually share such stories on Facebook nonstop, right? So there's no reason. So if you want to build a digital subscription base, you are not relying so much on Facebook. You should use Facebook as a promotional channel, as opposed to now Emily Bell said Facebook has swallowed journalism. But part of the reasons why this happens, because newspapers themselves, they decided to do whatever they can to get any attention without even thinking strategically about the long-term consequences of these strategies. So it's part of, at least a lot of these problems are self-inflicted, in my opinion, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, that shows why we need research, empirical research on something that may sound right, like print is dying and digital is the future. Probably it is the future, but it's the future for Facebook, not for news organizations, especially those local papers. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question, but
No, actually, yeah, that was actually a better answer to probably more of what I was thinking than I might have asked, because, in my experience in the newspaper industry for a very long time, you're right. It is self-inflicted and short-term thinking, seems to be the key factors to much of this, and then just thinking people would continue to pay for the paper because it's the paper, no matter what it is. And then finally realizing, when my neighbors were coming up to me going, the paper is so small, Christopher, why am I even paying for it? And these are people that have been 40-year, 50-year subscribers. So it's like, yeah, it's sad what has happened, and they've just chipped away to the point where all goodwill is gone.
and they created this fantasy that people drop print newspapers because it's no longer a relevant format in today's digital world, which is totally untrue. If there's anything I can share with the industry, is this statement, which is very often they say people are platform agnostic. I would say they are anything but. Because definitely consumers respond fundamentally differently to digital versus traditional products in almost every way. They just don't think they are the same things, just like steak versus ramen noodles. Okay, Joe?
Okay, the steak versus ramen thing, I want to challenge you on that a little bit. I mean, it's a clever metaphor, but let me just, as a former steak eater, so let's say I used to subscribe to the Statesman and the New York Times print. After I stopped subscribing to the New York's print, I discovered that I could also then afford to go for the electronic Washington Post and LA Times. So suddenly I have a richer media environment, which I engage in a different way. I subscribe to a bunch of their daily emails alerting me to what they have. And I guess as backdrop, I remember reading some of the very first electronic newspaper studies by Carrie Heater and a couple of other people. And most of us had trained ourselves to read newspapers. And Carrie discovered that it was difficult to go from our trained eye that scanned above the fold, below the fold, size of headline, all those things, this trained readership that we had. And she made it sound like it was going to be difficult to do. And I think it was, but over time, I think a lot of us did it. And so I don't really think of the print as steak so much anymore. I mean, sometimes several print statesmen pile up on my table while I'm reading everybody else's electronic version. And so I'm not sure. I think maybe the steak eaters are becoming either they're redefining what steak means, or they're not quite as loyal as I think you are maybe to the print product.
I would disagree with you. I think it's steak.
All right, no, it's a great metaphor. It doesn't apply to me anymore, and so it makes me worry about the idea.
No, I could explain. I think these local papers are like local steak houses. They've been serving steak for centuries, and they are usually the only steakhouse in town. They used to be. So they've been doing, relatively well selling steak. But one day, McDonald's came to town, and they panicked, not knowing what to do, because definitely McDonald's will actually take some of their customers away naturally. There's no question about that. So when panicking, they came up with this strategy. Now we are, being challenged by fast food chains. What should we do? So instead of, improving or securing their existing customers, they decided, we have to serve burgers as well. So they started doing it, which I describe as the whole digital transformation process. That's a goal. Meaning we want to serve burgers. Hopefully we can compete with McDonald's as a result. So over all these years, they tried very hard trying to come up with a burger that's comparable or competitive with McDonald's. But there's no way that they could do it, because as a local steakhouse, first of all, you don't have this know-how to make burgers. And even if you do, your burger is not going to be as competitive as McDonald's burgers because the price, or here we're talking about scale. You don't have the scale that McDonald's enjoys. So so over time they disinvest in print products. You can easily argue that's the case by looking at the number of journalists who lost their jobs over the past 12 or so years. Meaning they still serve steak, but kind of reluctantly, because they say, oh, it still pays the bill. So that's the reason. But they are, in their mind, they believe that's also the dinosaur product, which is dying anyway. So so instead of serving that same steak, the quality of their steak actually deteriorates as well greatly over time. And at the same time, they raise the price of that inferior steak. So are you seeing the formula of a disaster?
Yeah, no, it's yeah. I think the metaphor still needs work, but that leads to they have to make it more nuanced. I think it's maybe too much to dichotomize steak
Right,
ramen,
right,
because I think a lot of us are now in an intermediate state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes I try to use metaphors that are easier to understand, because when I talk to industry people, they are not going to look at my p-value or
No, that's
regression
probably
model. Thanks.
Iris, I have a question.
Sure.
And I think you have a very comprehensive list of variables to compare the print and the digital in terms of readership, in terms of subscription, and in terms of advertising. My question for you is the stock market valuation. If we like Rusty, like we come from all the entertainment media side. So if you compare the stock price of Netflix with let's see Disney, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a tech company has a 3-digit price to earning ratio. And for among, let's say, conventional media company, the price to earning ratio often is a single digit. And if they are lucky, they may be getting like 2 digits, all 2 digits kind of price to earning ratio. And that's why Netflix is by stock market valuation is actually the largest media company. And if we consider, say, Facebook and Google, they are actually a media company too, right? And you would say, like, the top 6 or top 5 media conglomerations, they in comparison are really teeny tiny. And that's the reason why the Disney and other media companies are now invest so much in this very intensified streaming platform war, like since the last couple of years, to improve their stock market valuation. So I think like large national newspapers such as New York Times also have such calculations. Like one big part of their revenue or like their financial resources based on their stock market performance. So how would your theory explain this part of their business model or calculations?
I think I'm not, I haven't looked into this very particular variable much, but overall I do I have observed, however, that the pressure is you want to look good to your investors. So I think unfortunately this pressure actually sometimes contributed to some narratives or some even strategies that are not that are actually problematic, because again, we're talking about being short-sighted, and why did they do that? Because there is this pressure from investors, and then in the stock market they have to look good every quarter. So that's why the New York Times, they have to, even New York Times, they have very attractive promotional offers, right? Why? And why every quarter they have to brag about their digital subscribers, while at the same time de-emphasize the importance of print. Because I think before I even talk about this today, very few actually would believe, with millions of subscribers on the digital side, still their print revenue accounted for, covered most of their the income. So actually, I think that's a very good point. It's a variable worth looking into. But overall, I think fundamentally it's the relationship between, what's really fundamentally important is the relationship between your product and your customers. So this is, I think, is the base for other things. But when you care about other things too much, very often you run the risk of ignoring what really matters for a sustainable business. So
very good. Any questions? Go ahead, Rusty.
I had a second question, but it's sort of not in the same path of the talk of today, and it's a little bit of a tangent. So I wanted others to be able to ask their questions first, if that was okay. But if no one has any other questions, I'm just curious about the idea of paywalls and the increase in online subscription to newspapers that are not local newspapers. Particularly specialty papers. As someone who studies entertainment media, I've run into an issue now because I used to use Vulture all the time for a lot of my discourse analysis, and Vulture now has a paywall, and so I'm having to run around finding different entertainment sites to get my news from now, because I'm afraid of which one's going to be next. And what if Variety and Hollywood Reporter and the other trades that we typically use start to use paywalls? Then what happens to researchers like us who get stuck having to put bills in using research material?
This is actually a very good question. Yeah, you go first.
Okay. Actually, the idea of having a paywall is also problematic in terms of, for example, during a crisis like hurricane or COVID, or this is when people need news the most, right? But at the same time, if you have a paywall, and that's blocking people who really have a huge demand for your content. So very often they realize they have to lift the paywall when things like this or disasters happen. So what's the point of having a paywall then? Because when people really need it, it has to be free, and then when they don't need it, you have this paywall back on again. So it's just like very, and also at the same time, newspapers are now becoming expensive, so expensive in print, and then online you have a paywall. So there's this access problem. You're excluding those who cannot afford your products. So that changed the nature of the product as well, and the function, the social function of news media. Because now you're talking New York Times, for example, you are being read by people who can afford it. But that's now becoming like a very smaller group of people as opposed to in the past. But that's probably not the best example, because it has always been an elite paper. But I mean, local papers, for example, they are now not as accessible as they used to be. So that's a problem. not just from the business sense, but also because to begin with, paywalls are not generating a lot of meaningful revenue to begin with, right? But then there are other issues because now citizens have no channel through which to receive high quality news. So that's what most journalism professors are concerned about. But when journalism professors stop subscribing to local papers, this is really something going on, and that's just not I'm not really optimistic about the trend. Yes, Joe?
So this actually brings up a direction, thanks to Rusty for the question, that I kind of wanted to go in, because when you think about it in kind of a meta economic way, I mean, newspapers used to have three bases of revenue, newsstand sales, advertising, subscription. And so when you say paywall, what you're really meaning these days is subscription, like electronic subscription. Mm-hmm. And so it's, since advertising has been kind of swallowed by Google and mm-hmm. Facebook, as you say, and not too many of us live near newsstands, it's, there's kind of a movement, I think, in a meta way, with the swallowing of advertising by a couple of big key players. Everybody else is pushed into subscription. And you see that in TV. I mean, I'm thinking about it that way because I'm doing a project on globalization of streaming TV. And you can see it both domestically and globally, a rapid movement toward subscription TV, even though it's a lot less profitable than the subscriptions they used to get on cable or the advertising they used to get. But I think they find them, so I think they're kind of fleeing that direction because it seems to be a model of desperation that kind of works. And the question, I guess,
I think there's, I'm sorry, I would like to add a bit.
Please.
I think there's a difference between, for example, Netflix. Because you're talking about here in the US, at least, you're talking about local papers. They are so small. And even in the good old days, they were not really gigantic because they serve like a very narrowly defined geographic area, and with only local monopoly. So they never really had that resource to develop anything digital that is considered
No, I
excellent.
think the local papers are quite right. In fact, that actually leads into the second part of my question, that one of the things that seems to be happening in both the newspaper medium and now streaming TV medium is kind of a potential narrowing of who can get to be a successful subscription player. It seems like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, possibly the Washington Post, possibly the LA Times, possibly a few others. But when it begins to rest with a subscription model, there isn't much room, and it nationalizes the competition away from the locals. So I'm agreeing with you, actually. I'm worried about it too. In fact, when Hung and I are working on a project on local Texas papers in small towns, and they're sort of surviving. In fact, one encouraging thing we find is that a lot of the local business, even if it doesn't make sense for them to advertise in the paper, they do because they want to make sure the paper stays alive.
And I don't know if you, probably most of you get the free paper in your mailbox, which is the Community Impact newspaper. They actually, at least before COVID, they've been doing very well. They actually expanded from Texas to Arizona and probably Tennessee as well. So relying solely on advertising revenue, and that's how they, because I talked to the publisher and then he told me the attention you're going to get or the engagement level you're going to reach online is minimal these days for obvious reasons. But to deliver that copy of a free paper to your home, and for many of us, at least for me, it stays on people's coffee table for at least a week. or a few days at least. So that's the kind of engagement. So I think, again, the core of the problem is engagement, because online, even if you, I don't know how much time you spend NewYorkTimes.com, but it seems like people don't visit the newspaper site every day at all. Actually, when they do visit, they spend a few minutes and then they log out. So, and very often, it's, I think online is out of sight, out of mind. There's this tendency, but the physical product is a different story.
It's interesting because another advantage online, frankly, has is that if you check it fairly often, which maybe I'm an atypical reader because I'll go back 3 or 4 times a day to see what's new on the New York Times. Very atypical reader, perhaps. But then when I get the Statesman the next morning, in the first section, nope, know about that already. Oh yeah, here's a local angle. I'll read that. No, read that already, read that already, read that already. And I find myself spending much more time with the Metro section than with the front section, because that's the genuine local value added. And so I think for small papers, that's their strategic advantage, the hyper localism or whatever we want to call that. Even for the Statesman, frankly, honestly, I don't get so much out of their front section, except when they do a major investigative story, which they do pretty well. So if it's a major local investigative story, I read it. If it's national news, chances are I don't. So I think it's they have to redefine the product somewhat to figure out how they do engage people. What's the actual engaging quality they have?
Right.
I'd love to talk.
There's something inherent in this digital medium where it's just, there are probably 3 different reasons why people consider online news as an inferior good. First of all, physically, it's kind of, you are probably a little atypical, but most people don't enjoy reading long text online. So first of all, and also the website are usually cluttered with, annoying ads. There's really very little reason for people to love a newspaper website, especially when they are desperate about, inserting all kinds of ads. So there's this theory about why. And the second thing is like, simply because it has been, or it was offered for a long time for free. That also changed how we perceive the quality of a product. So actually, psychologists, they did experiments. They'll give you the same red wine, and there's a control group and experimental group. And then when they will tell them, this is like $100 a bottle, that one's $10. And then guess what? People who believe they get a high-priced wine will think that tastes better as well. So there's this psychological effect. And the third one is like human brains process digital things fundamentally differently than when we do with physical, tangible media. So when you imagine, you think about how you respond these days to a printed greeting card as opposed to an e-card, right? So they serve the same purpose, but these days, who is still exciting about getting an e-card? So I think there's something here as well. That's a biological explanation. So there are many different plausible reasons why this ramen noodles theory kind of still holds. Yeah.
I think we can keep debating on these issues. And also, I actually have a question about what's your take on Facebook's New Deal with the Australian government and the coming.
I thought I'd get a question like that.
Right?
I haven't really looked a lot into this thing, but the idea, like the first reaction I had was like, isn't that great news? That Facebook, which swallowed journalism, disappeared from the scene. So what's the problem? So, it's kind of funny that how these days you have to be on Facebook. So previously they said the worst thing then being indexed by Google is not to be indexed by Google, but now it's the first Facebook version of the same story. So I actually think it will be very interesting just to see if in a market where newspaper is Facebook is no longer a player in the news scene, whether local news organizations will actually be able to regain some of the control over their readership. So I'm actually quite excited about what's going on. Unfortunately, I don't think this will last long because it seems like people are upset about not being able to share anything on news-wise on Facebook. What's your view about this?
Wow, it's too complicated. I think it's time to discuss public media, because if you only rely on the market, there will be never a good solution that taking into account the healthy function of the public sphere, the public service dimension of news media. And I hope and obviously here in the US, I don't think there's any political will to go that route. So my hope is on EU, on Australia and Canada, and I hope there will be more regulation, and then there will be some, middle ground where the digital giants and the news media industry meet with one another in the middle.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen next as well. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you.
Very engaging talk. You got us all asking lots of questions, so that's a good point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.